Before Nomadland won for Best Film, there was a sweep of a homeless encampment near the theater. The film details the journey of a woman who becomes housing insecure due to not just the closing of a factory, but the entire town that houses the workers as well. A despondent irony that the presence of actual homeless people would ruin the glamorous red carpet catwalk that the film industry's elite grace on awards night. We often hear the term affordable housing as part of the solution for the unhoused problem. But as our guest Tracy J. Rosenthal explains, the public-private partnership is a relationship that doesn't equal very good results for those truly in need of affordable shelter. From her piece in the New Republic, the affordable housing paradigm is not a benign compromise between public and private interests. It is the institutionalization of racism and the Red Scare, a system bent into shape by the power of real estate, not designed to serve tenants' human needs. We'll discuss the myths of affordable housing with the founder of the LA Tenants Union, Tracy J. Rosenthal. This is Revolution. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. We're going to be talking one of my favorite subjects today, and that's housing. So there's a lot of us here today. We almost have a full house. So let me introduce my co-host, my homie, my dog. You might have missed him on Thursday, but he's back today. Pascal Robert, how are you?
Peace and greetings to all the audience and the wonderful Jason Miles. How are you, my brother?
I'm doing all right. And coming all the way from Maine, you may know him as the Black Guy in Maine. We know him as Marcus from the Left Flank Vets. Marcus from the Left Flank Vets.
How's it going? The Black Guy in Maine says Free Palestine.
the Black Guy in Maine.
The Black Guy in Maine.
Coming from the soulful city of Philadelphia, you may know him as Labor Paul on Jacobin, but we know him by his true nature. He's a gangster. It's Pyru Paul Prescott.
Hey, great to be back. I'm recovered from the Finkelstein episode, so I'm ready to go.
And coming at us all the way live from her hood to y'all hood. She was quoted in that quick little video. I've been reading as much as I can on her over the last few days. I found this person. I posted a LA Times article about something that was going on in LA. I am a subscriber to the Times. I think they cover the state as about as good as anybody can. Especially they have a pretty good division that talks about housing. And there was an article about some real estate developers that had got an initiative through that was going to clean up the streets, so to speak. They were going to round up all these homeless people on Skid Row and get them into housing. And there was a lot of pushback actually from the housing community. And this person's piece, Tracy J. Rosenthal's piece, the judge had cited in his decision. So without any further ado, she's the co-founder of the LA Tenants Union, Tracy J. Rosenthal.
Hey everyone. This former Jewish American princess says Free Palestine.
Right on. We actually did a Palestine episode with our good friend. I don't know if I'd call her a Jewish American princess to her face. Nora Barrows Friedman.
But I loved what you said at the beginning, and I think I've been thinking so much today and just over the years. I mean, Palestine is a housing struggle. That is also a housing struggle. It's a struggle over land. It's a struggle over the legitimacy of a right to stay and a right to return. And I think, in the tenants union, all of these struggles are connected. All of them follow the same patterns and the same forms. And I think we can see, the landlord at the level of a state in what Israel is doing right now. And so I think that it's our responsibility as tenant organizers to stand with Palestine and speak on for their liberation, and to understand that the only situation that will bring peace is the liberation of the Palestinian people.
Right on, Tracy. You just walking in the door with fire today, huh? You fired up?
Good morning.
Yeah, and I'll say, like, I think Cori Bush did a great job of doing kind of the same thing of connecting the current, whatever the struggles are going on in our lives day to day with the international community and having, a sense of internationalism with the left. And, she went on the House floor and talked about, her experience with Black Lives Matter and saying the same thing, with Palestinians have been dealing with militarized occupation in their communities, in their neighborhoods, and just the same way that, people in the United States have been dealing, or worse case, actually. And so thank you. Yeah. Bringing an international scope to all these issues we care about is what's necessary to try and move the ball. So.
Indeed.
Oh, Pascal, did you have the questions ready to go?
Yeah,
Jason dipped out.
I'm having a little bit of connection issues on my end, so I'll be dipping in and out a little bit.
Pascal got the questions. Come on, is that
Pascal
even?
does have questions, because you know why Pascal has questions? I sent over. Tracy asked very nicely yesterday at like noon. Hey, do you have any questions for me? Please feel free to send them over. And me personally, I'm a little more free flowing with questions, so I was like, I kind of want to talk about.
I give you permission to hit me with whatever, especially because I didn't exactly prepare. So in that case, we can, as you like. But I'm happy to, try my best to steal other people's research, and all the work I do is really communal. So nothing that I say I probably invented. I'm really just trying to synthesize synthesizing the work of the tenants in the union, the history of the tenant movement, and just really anything I say would be something that they invented. So just to make that clear, and I'll just do my best to do that.
No, most of our questions are based off your work that we could find. So we're not going to hit you with any crazy shit that you don't know about. Like in 47.
According to quantum computing.
Oh shit, no.
There is one thing that you did talk about that I think Pascal is going to ask about this, and stop me, Pascal, if you're going to ask a better question. You bring up the fact in a lot of your work that an anti-communism Red Scare is a big reason why we look at private ownership over public ownership. And the first thing I thought about when I read that, and again, you're not an LA native, so maybe you don't know the story, but you seem to know a lot about the city's history. Chavez Ravine.
Yeah. So I think that's a really great example. And I've lived in LA for more than a decade. So it's my adopted home. It's the place that I fight for. And in researching the history of housing policy, it is a particularly unique and vicious place. And so I can tell that story, and I think it's especially important to retell that story because the way that it's narrated is not correct. Like, we often hear that there was supposed to be, that Chavez Ravine was cleared for the building of Dodger Stadium. And that actually misses an entire period of history called the Red Scare. So the story of Chavez Ravine is the story of the violent removal of people from their homes. However, what was promised to those people was public housing, and a Neutra designed public housing complex with beautiful gardens,
schools and parks. Oh, it was gorgeous. Yeah,
exactly. And so this is the promise that was offered to this community. And that promise was, even after it was paid for by the federal government, the city council signed on to the project, and then business interests, developer and landlord forces collaborated with McCarthy Republicans to oust the to basically run trials against the public housing authorities within Los Angeles and kill the program. So Los Angeles was promised public housing to thousands of people. And then the Red Scare was mobilized in order to go back on that promise. And Chavez Ravine was one of the sites where that promise was made, that promise was broken, and in its place was vacant land that then was turned over to private interests, and in what then became Dodger Stadium. So I think, for instance, Don Parsons has this amazing book called Making a Better World, Public Housing and the Public Housing, the Red Scare, and the Future of Los Angeles. And it really tells this story about how the Red Scare was weaponized to basically to prevent there being any more public housing and to prevent public housing from taking hold even as an idea. And that, like, in the legacy of these public-private partnerships that we call affordable housing is the institutionalization of the Red Scare, is the anti-communist legacy of basically private fear of competition from the public market. And I think I'm really happy that you picked up on it, because it's so important to remember that history. Like, in the article that I wrote, I came across one of the first people who tried to fuck with tenants living in affordable housing was this right-wing anti-communist pastor. And he owned this affordable housing building and was leveraging the rhetoric of anti-communism while trying to evict these tenants. So that this history, and this history lives on. The tenants that are in the union that we're helping support, they're organizing in a building, in an affordable housing building that's currently under attack. Their landlord recently called the government's attempts to intervene like living in Venezuela. So that this is both, it has a history, the Red Scare has a history, but it also has a present, and it's really with us now. And when we demand better housing, when we demand public housing, when we demand a housing system that enshrines the rights of tenants, what we face over and over again is anti-communist sentiment and the Red Scare.
Dig it. Mm-hmm. That's a very important narrative.
Mm-hmm. It is an extremely important narrative, because I think it also it changes the way we look at, just in general, the term public housing. We look at it from a very punitive standpoint. And to think about what it could have been. And even if you look at the early Pruitt-Igro projects, they definitely were built out to be kind of these wonderful buildings. Pascal, did you want to ask your question?
Yeah, well, I wanted to start off by asking you, Tracy, is that, well, one of your affordable housing is actually a scheme that works to the advantage of landlords and developers as opposed to poor and working class tenants. Can you elaborate on how this exactly is the case, since the notion of affordable housing kind of conjures up this concept of like helping poor and working class people, but you do a very, very eloquent job of making us know that that's not the case. Can you elaborate on that for our audience?
For sure. I think that's, I think it's super important. And I think one of the most confusable things about the policy known as affordable housing is it uses the name of what we think of as a social good, affordable housing that people can afford. But this is a policy paradigm that is privately owned, publicly subsidized housing. And that's what distinguishes it from public housing, which would be like the provision of a social good. This is the private hoarding of a social good with public subsidies. And so there are many ways that landlords and developers benefit from these public-private partnerships called affordable housing. One is simply the resources. One of the largest affordable housing programs called LIHTC, it's the Low Income Housing Credit Tax. In order to pay for it, the US government forgoes more than $10 billion a year in taxes. So this is basically a transfer of wealth to developers for the sake of their building affordable housing. However, when you dig into the program, you see that the affordable housing that's built isn't actually affordable. It's for tenants making like 70% of area median income, which in LA is you have to work 1.5 times a minimum wage job in order to make that. So they're not, these affordable buildings aren't for poor and working people. They're for the middle class, and the government is literally forking over money for people, for private developers to profit off of them. Then I think you can see another central benefit besides the direct transfer of wealth is the permanent hoarding of land. So even though in order to receive these subsidies, you have to sign on to a contract that says you'll restrict rents for this number of, it was 15, now it's 30, depending on where you live, it could be a little bit more. But these are ultimately temporary contracts, yet the subsidies are permanent. The benefits of getting the benefits of building whatever you build through this process, that's permanent. You can collect market rate rents in perpetuity after the program expires. So this is even though it is the benefits to tenants are temporary, the benefits to developers are permanent. So I think that those, like the direct transfer of wealth, the permanent access to market rate rents, I think those are two really good examples. There's also the developers often collaborate with each other on these projects because affordable housing can be leveraged to go around or renegotiate other forms of restrictions on buildings, like zoning rules and like zoning and use laws. And they also they contribute to gentrification in a neighborhood because they speed and encourage private development and the raising of property values across communities. So this is one way in which the developers use affordable housing for their own profit on a given project, but also in the project of developing an entire neighborhood. So you'll often see developers with multiple projects in the same community because they benefit from the speculation that occurs through their impact. So even some of them are financed with what's called tax increment financing, which is they're financed based on their own gentrifying impact in a community. So I think that's another example of how these projects really benefit developers. And then maybe finally, I'll just say ideologically, these programs are really weaponized for the sake of ignoring and delegitimizing any alternative to a market-based policy. And so what we see over and over is that the promise that the market can solve a problem that it itself has caused, and that the market itself can solve a problem that it has never in its history solved. And so over and over, affordable housing is used by politicians on both sides of the aisle to delegitimize public provision, any kind of alternative to the status quo that we have now.
Wow, that's incredible. Any of you guys have a
And
follow-up
you said you weren't prepared.
Right.
I mean, I
Lies.
guess I'm as prepared as you can be when you are, when you sort of like, to both my benefit and detriment, like live and breathe it. So I appreciate that.
Oh no, you're
Well,
right.
I don't know if this is like a more of a follow, but just kind of like how this thing kind of works out in depth is like the privatization of communal spaces and this like context that it's supposed to be for everyone. And so like you use the terms of like access to affordable housing, and like access to affordable blank is like a Democrat's talking point,
Right.
ready made.
I got access to a Tesla.
Exactly. Right.
Yeah.
But
Yeah,
like with housing, it comes out whether like there's these certain like housing authorities, and that's sort of too is like that I've had some work in, is that every state seems to have this housing authority that will help with affordable housing, and they try and this many like 10 or like houses or this many apartments have to go towards affordable housing, or these certain buildings for a certain amount of years have to keep their rents within certain but it's all just these reforms that don't really get that are pointing to the actual issue, where we've got more empty houses than we do homeless people. And I mean, that's the thing. It was like Kropotkin was talking about this, of just going house to house, find the empty ones, put people in it, find the ones where there's only 3 people staying in these big mansions, say, hey, sorry, you gotta switch this around.
Let's actually build on that for a second, because that actually happened in not just here in West Oakland. The Moms for Housing did it and actually was able to get some press for it, which was negative for the city, so negative to the point where the city ended up buying the house through eminent domain, and the moms can live there now. And also where you were, Tracy, in LA over Thanksgiving, there was that situation where a similar organization had agreed to get so many houses from Caltrans, because Caltrans, our transportation service here in California, had bought all these houses in the 60s and 70s for a freeway project that never happened. They had agreed to give so many. You might know the story better than I.
Yeah, the reclaiming our homes. So yeah, this is a lot of our members were supporting this project. And yeah, the history of Caltrans is also really embedded in the history of these urban renewal projects. And one, Caltrans purchased all of this land along a corridor to build a freeway, but then the community was able to stop that project, stop the raising of their homes. However, Caltrans maintained ownership of a lot of these houses. And what they did was that with that ownership was allow vacancy. So these gorgeous boarded up houses all along this, what was supposed to be a freeway corridor. And so during a pandemic where the only prescription that we knew of for COVID-19 was housing, right? Was isolation, was having your own space and social distance from people. Many people who were housed precariously in their cars, living outside, or in overcrowded housing. A group of them got together to break into these homes and reclaim them. So they were called Reclaiming Our Homes. And this project of expropriating state property for public good is really, I think, really important to also relate to what the tenants, the article that I wrote about affordable housing was inspired by our Hillside Via Tenants Association, who are demanding that the state expropriate the building from the landlord and turn it over to the tenants so that they can remain there permanently. So I think we're seeing the call for expropriation of private property and publicly held but underused property from all sides of the tenant movement. Both housed and unhoused people are making the same claim. And I think you can say that there are tenants who are living in Echo Park. We're also making the same claim, right? Support us or leave us alone. That this public space has the right to be used, and it's the right to use the space by people who want to live there is the most important claim that we should allow on that space. And so I think it's really essential to connect all of these demands for expropriation as the radical demands that the tenants unions and tenants movements are making at this time, in complete opposition to what you were saying, Marcus, to that means-tested, market-based solutions that that are parroted, that basically our politicians parrot developers in offering us.
And I just want to come in and say with the this public-private partnership model, I think it's so insidious because it's like how we do everything now. Like it's used for infrastructure projects. I mean, that was like the big thing that Trump had proposed, and I'm sure it's a big part of Biden's plan. Like contracting out city contracts, city work, and like you said, it's like the market creating a problem. And with education, it's like with the growth of charter schools that are draining money out of the public school system, and then the public school system is declining, and then the charters, reinforce that by, putting themselves up as a solution. But yeah, it's and like, the sound of public private, I think makes people think of like, oh, it's such a reasonable centrist solution. We'll have some of, some of public, some of private.
Everybody wins.
Right. So yeah, I mean, it's just really insidious, and it's the model of how we do everything in this country.
Yeah, I think that's really important, and I think it's really important to know that it's only in the context of austerity that a public-private partnership even starts to become an idea. So it's only after the withdrawal of public resources for public goods that you start to see local governments turn towards the private market, basically as supplicants, right? Like as and of course it is embedded with the project of economic growth, that in order for cities to have any funding in the absence of federal support, right, they turn towards the private market. But yet that feeds the cycle of it becoming federal policy, even though the federal government has the capacity to print its own currency, right? That we know now, like thanks to MMT scholars and others, that austerity is a myth. The idea of a deficit is a myth, that we have the resources for these public programs. So I think it's like, what you said, Paul, is I really appreciate, and it's also just important to know that only starts to become possible in the context when we are refused public resources.
I actually wanted to play off that question, which was my next question, is that can you give us some examples of exactly how this kind of public-private partnership, which to me is really just neoliberalism when we come down to it, how this really particularly disadvantages the housing rights movement and the demand for quality housing?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I talk a lot in the text about the way I think I talk a lot about the text, in the text, about how tenants themselves are imperiled while living in this context, right? So I think like one of the simply endangering tenants' lives and well-being is like probably one of the primary aggressors, right, against like people in our movement. And then, but do you mean more like, just to understand your question, do you mean like on the level of like on the level of debate, like how do these policies
in terms of this actual policy, material policy examples of how this particular type of agenda has worked to disadvantage? I know in one of your writings you talk about Hope 6 and a few other programs in terms of how they've worked to kind of short end the stick for housing advocates. If you have any examples.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, that's super helpful. I think I just needed a little more clarity around your question. Yeah, I can speak to the history of Hope 6. That's like a perfect example of a policy that synthesizes Republican anti-communism and Democratic anti-communism combined into like what is called the compromise, which is the destruction of public housing and their replacement with publicly owned, with publicly subsidized, privately owned housing, affordable housing. And so we saw in Boyle Heights, for instance, a neighborhood in the east of Los Angeles, that the destruction of the largest public housing projects west of the Mississippi under the auspices of a Democratic administration. It happened under the Clinton administration, right? And so these projects were destroyed. 600 apartments were removed from the community. And so the all in the name of improving the community. But the community was not revitalized. It was not improved. It was removed. And so I think that is really that program of Hope 6 is really a perfect example of the harms that are caused in the name of these public-private partnerships, and also a really great example of how the ideals of revitalization, growth, community improvement are leveraged against poor and working class people.
Absolutely. So can you really explain to us particularly how the distinction between affordable housing versus public housing is important to note, and why one offers a much more humane alternative to the current housing crisis than the other?
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. So really you think about the incentives of the private market, right? So I think it's actually really important. So we can think about public housing as publicly owned, publicly funded housing, and affordable housing as publicly funded, privately owned housing. So we know that housing is a human need. And we know that the interests of capital and the interests of our human needs are fundamentally misaligned. So I think it's really important to think about the incentive structure of public housing as the provision of a social good and to serve a social need. Whereas in the provision of affordable housing, like the funding of affordable housing is supposed to serve a social need while producing profit for corporations, developers, and for private interests. And I think that, from that basis, we can understand why affordable housing is consistently fails to serve poor people, wastes our resources, drains our drains our budgets, and actually just helps continues the crisis that is unending in a state where affordable housing is the main policy tool. Right now, at this point in history, the only supply side policy that the US has to build housing for people who can't afford market rate rents is affordable housing. It's privately owned. And so I think I would absolutely, I think it's really essential that we understand that there is an alternative. But also I think it's really important that we understand that, that we don't I think it's really important that we don't over romanticize the history of public housing either. Because public housing as an ideal, right? As something that is community controlled, as something that is like, that can democratize resources, that can allow people to organize for their own safety, their own security, that they can decide together what public spaces in their communities could be used for. That is like, that's a tenant movement ideal. But the history of public housing in the US is also riven with the warehousing of poor and mostly people of color. And I think it's important that we don't get stuck in the idea that the state is a necessarily benevolent state, because in its history, public housing has had a lot more in common with. There's a really great essay by Peter Marcuse, who I'm sort of quoting here, which talks about how the history of public housing has more in common with like company towns than we like to think. And with the kinds of, as we've noticed over time, the imbrication of policing and public housing should really tell us that those institutions are one in the same system of carceral housing that we've used to warehouse the poor and people of color, rather than, promote this ideal, the
socialist ideal that people like to throw on top
that
of it.
we've never had. It was never allowed to exist. And I think we can still advocate for that vision. I think we absolutely have to. At the same time, we have to throw out the cops from housing in order to imagine a housing system that is humane, and to imagine a public housing system that is humane. So I think just to put a little more nuance I think it's essential that we put a little more nuance as we're advocating for public housing, to distinguish it from the ways in which public housing has actually been leveraged against our most vulnerable communities.
Now, I did want to ask you real quick. Oh, I'm sorry. I just want to get this question in quick and then I'll disappear again. I heard you mention on another podcast you were on, you did some work at a room key hotel. I actually worked at one here in the Bay Area, and I know that there's a very kind of stark differences between the Bay and LA and how that all worked out. SROs as some sort of solution, or single room occupancy hotels as a solution. How do you feel about that? As part of a solution, not the only solution.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say, I've been really amazed with the organizing that's happening within Project Roomkey right now. So these are tenants who, just to explain a little bit, that these are tenants who are now unhoused tenants who are being offered rooms in hotels throughout the pandemic. So now there's organizing happening in this context, even though the, they make a really big deal about referring to you as a person in a program and not a tenant. But the conditions that people are living in, there are 7 p.m. curfews. The food is disgusting. You are treated again,
as I said, there's LA and the Bay Area is very different, because we did not run we didn't have a curfew.
Well, so these are run by Ours are run by different nonprofits.
Yes.
The one I'm speaking of particularly is the Salvation Army, who is
wow.
I mean, basically in the same way that the state is the landlord, Salvation Army is the property management company. And they are, as property management companies often are, they are aggressive, rude, and more interested in the interests of the property owner than in who they're housing. And so that's been the experience of like my friend Phoenix and my friend, like the people that are like have to live in these spaces. So I just wanted to like make that clear to say that, you know, the work that they're doing is some of the most important organizing that we have. And I just wanted to like give a huge, like, I think that, you know, supporting our unhoused neighbors as tenants is one of the most essential points of solidarity that we have, that advocating for the use of public space for the human right to housing, advocating for the, you know, like there is no decommodification of housing without our unhoused neighbors leading that fight. So just to make that clear. And then, yeah, just to talk about SROs, I mean, in my mind, any place where tenants live can be public housing if you stop paying rent and defend that housing. So in this case, I often think of, you know, the project of a tenants movement is not the building of housing, but the building of power. So an organized SRO can become public housing through a process of organization, through a process of rent strikes and eviction defense. And I mean, this is like you know, this is another kind of vision. So I know often we talk about solutions as like, you know, how should we use, we often talk about solutions thinking like states, thinking like the protagonist of like governments or the protagonist of policymakers. But when we think about the protagonists of tenants in SROs can make SROs the solution to their housing needs. Like if they
would you say, no, I understand what you're saying, and I don't think I told this to you when we were initially having our back and forth on Twitter, but not just working at one, I actually kind of sort of blew the whistle on a lot of things that were going on inside of the one that I was at that I felt was very unsafe for not just staff, but also definitely the residents, as they had some COVID outbreaks that were handled badly. So there's a problem with nonprofits that run these things, right? Because like you said, the state has the money, the state hands it over to a nonprofit that usually works with housing, and then they walk away. They don't deal with it, and everything is contracted out, from the food. And you're right, the food is shit because people go, who's going to complain? And I think there's something that people don't really realize when you talk about the unhoused is no one wants to listen to you complain once I can say you're crazy. And the one thing I'll say about Los Angeles is the organizing that goes on in your unhoused community kind of is on another level than what I deal with. And it feels partially because people aren't deeming everybody that's on the street as insane.
And I think that it's actually so important that you bring this up right now, because California is fighting tooth and nail to get involuntary committing back on, like, is to return the right to involuntarily commit people. And I think that goal, combined with the recent push towards mandatory shelters, should tell us something incredibly despicable about the future of policymaking around unhoused populations, is that the state is setting itself up to not just wield the designation of craziness to like discount the ideas of people living outside, but to literally incarcerate them in mental institutions once more. So I think that that's really important to bring up. I think it's really, I think that's really important to bring up. I think it's like really just, you know, essential what you said about, you know, the way that it's amazing, you know, as soon as you start talking online about making critiques of Project Roomkey, as if people should be grateful for the worst possible treatment. And, you know, if you start with you just, I mean, for me, it's like you have to start with the position of everything for everyone. And everything for everyone means like that we should be like, means that people living anywhere deserve like the best quality food. They deserve the best.
And here's, dig this. I'm sorry to cut you off. I just want you to dig this.
Please.
Dig
Or
this for a second.
Shut up. Sorry. I just
No. Dig this for a second. This was a real thing that happened, and I want to give you guys kind of an idea, and I wanted to hear the homies get back with me on this. And I think maybe Marcus, me, you, and Pascal talked about this before. So when I was there, there's a food budget, right? Because the hotel kept their staff. A lot of their staff left because A, it was COVID, and B, you're talking about an extremely vulnerable population that you're dealing with very little protections, right? Mm-hmm. So they're working with a skeleton crew, and the food at first was what you would get from a hotel banquet. Mm-hmm. And then as they kind of figured out their budget, they got the same thing, and it definitely went down in quality to the point where sometimes it would look like vomit. And also they couldn't keep a kitchen staff. And the owners of the hotel had owned several hotels that agreed to get into this project because you're getting so much money. The hotels were getting like $100 a night for every room, regardless if it was filled. Mm-hmm. So you're going to take that money, and you're getting extra money for the food, right? So some of the residents would come to me and they say, "Hey, man, these guys are stealing the food." And let's be honest, some people talk to themselves. Mm-hmm. Some people yell at shit that's not there. Some people want to fight you for no reason. So you have to take certain things with a grain of salt. But, you know, the third person saying these guys are stealing food, I was like, well, let's just see. And I walked outside, and sure enough, when the food delivery came, the staff was taking boxes of food that wasn't the food that was being served and putting it in their cars in front of the residents. Like, they weren't even trying to hide it, because who's going to say anything when you're already deemed crazy? I don't listen to, you know, the hardest thing to do is to convince someone that you're not crazy. Try doing that for a second, especially when you're on the street. So that was like real shit that happened.
What you said is so important too. Like, I think we didn't even bring it up yet, but you know, like FEMA was handing out money. Handing out money. Any person who was put in a non-congregate shelter situation during the pandemic, that was reimbursable by the federal government. So the fact that there was even one single person sleeping outside in a context where there was the offer of 100% reimbursement by the federal government tells us that these policymakers, they're not operating. I mean, it's simply unconscionable and cruel to an extent that actually ceases to make fiscal sense. Like, if you're to be reimbursed at 100% means that it's simply free, and to not do it is to only be motivated by cruelty. There's no other. There seems to be no other reason.
And the nonprofit is paid by filled beds, so they're trying to fill beds. I won't get it. I just want to hear what you guys.
Well, I think something that you brought up earlier is like just the importance of universality. I think I think we talk about a lot of this too, is like with the whole thing with like you know, it's like, yeah, having a Black Lives Matter movement, you know, regardless of like what some of the leadership are doing, is like, that doesn't actually address the issue, right? Having an equitable amount of police brutality should not be the goal.
Equitable
When
amount of police brutality.
we got to make sure white people, Latinos, and Black people are all getting their ass kicked at the same rates. You know, that is equality. Or,
that's a seat at the
you know,
table.
with seat at the table. Yeah, with healthcare, you know, same thing. You know, pointing at the disparities in the lack of healthcare for Black and brown people. You know, that shouldn't be the goal, to make sure that like, oh, the equitable amount of people are going without healthcare. And so, yeah, I think, you know, focusing on the universality of programs that guarantee that of whether it's housing, healthcare, education, and what you kind of last said is that it also makes fiscal sense in all situations. Just guaranteeing, skipping the hoops, skipping the all the bureaucracy and the red tape, it actually saves money. It makes the process easier, simpler, faster, more efficient, and also better. So you can start focusing on like what are actually the, you know, good and bad results of what we're doing, and can we fix those things. But then, yeah, a third thing, which has to do with just giving the autonomy of the people who are experiencing whatever program to decide what's best for the future of said program. So it's actually asking the tenants of what should the housing look like. And, you know, I think when you reference the opportunity beforehand, it looks like something with a school and some type of recreation and all of these parks and all like walkable spaces.
We tried to do that because, again, it's a hotel, which isn't set up like an apartment complex. It's actually set up more for anonymity than it is for community. But, you know, we tried as best we could. We only had a few kids there. And one of the residents there was a teacher, and she actually was kind of depressed. And I was like, hey, would you mind teaching again? Because we have these kids that can't read. And we set up, you know, distanced schooling through donations from people to give us books and everything like that for that. And it was great. And then all that, and that was free for the nonprofit. It was me finding people outside that wanted to donate time to do things like yoga and meditation, strength training to get people that couldn't walk that well back and mobile again. All this was free. We had art therapy classes from other people that work there that just wanted to help besides, you know, opening doors. You're right. No one got a key. You do not get a key. And you don't get the hotel lock for safety. All this county removes all those, by the way. Go ahead. So you had a question?
Oh, just to go on what Mark is saying about universality. I mean, one reason I've been kind of quiet is I don't know too much about affordable housing, that world. And one reason I don't know about it is because it's so confusing to me. And it's like a labyrinth when we're talking about just the different existing programs and policies. And recently, I mean, long story short, I had this meeting with someone who's active in affordable housing in Philly recently, and it was a group of us that just wanted to know more about the lay of the land. And like, I left that meeting extremely confused still. And it wasn't because the person explaining it didn't do well. It was just because it's such this like hodgepodge.
Oh, damn. Deep state got him.
Although I
got him.
With I guess I'll fit, you know, like I could go on with my own anecdote about that, just like with so like I work with veteran housing, and within the veterans space, you've got the top rate of like someone that's got honorable discharge, no criminal history, and has already filled out, you know, whatever paperwork to get into the VA, and then they could get, you know, like it still take, you know, up to a few months to secure some type of voucher system, you know, and then like, hey, how that voucher system goes on, they have to do these check-ins and all this type of stuff. But then it could go to someone who maybe had, you know, has a dishonorable discharge, in which case, like, you don't get anything. There's like no programs to help you. And there's actually housing programs that are for civilians.
Damn, deep state gumbo.
Right.
I'm
Don't
sorry you
talk
asked
about,
me to come on your show. I feel
They're
like
saying-
I'm like, it's me. I'm sorry.
they're saying, don't talk about military housing now. Nope.
Yeah,
Not gonna let you do that.
They snatched the life out of your ass.
I was just going on. What did I stop? Where should I?
Dude, you got Thanos.
That was like,
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about.
that was like when
Well, this is-
Forrest Gump giving that speech at the rally, and the military death all that.
And that's all
But that-
I have to say
that's
about
Right.
that.
Yeah, that's the thing, especially with veterans. Even with there's a disparity in like when you see these cities, it'll say, "Oh, we ended, veteran homelessness." That's just like a bold-faced lie. They will find the people who are able to fit these different parameters, as far as receiving a HUD bash voucher.
Mhm.
And then once they get that, they're like, okay, we're good. It's like, oh, those people with dishonorable discharges or those people with criminal histories, those aren't real veterans. Those aren't real patriots.
Mhm.
But then if like you're outside of that, if you weren't willing to sign your name for imperialism, then like it becomes infinitely worse of possibilities to actually find housing and then actually get permanent housing, which isn't really the goal of affordable housing.
No, because there's so many rules that people have to follow when you get your quote unquote permanent housing, which I love the fact that Tracy pointed out isn't permanent. And that's the selling point. That was how a lot of people came to the shelter in the first place. They were like, look, if you come here, we're going to find you permanent housing. And I know for a fact, one of the women at the shelter got into housing and I was like, oh, is it permanent? She goes, well, it's for 18 months. Like, what is shit? She's been waiting for the better part of a year in the shelter I was in. Then she was at some, on the street before that. And someone tells you you're going to get permanent housing, you get permanent housing, you get permanent housing. It's like, well, this is for 18 months until the next thing. And then I have to figure it out for the next thing.
Right.
And it's outside of her control.
I saw someone say this online, which I loved, that it's like when we want to incentivize rich people to do something, we give them money. And when we want to incentivize poor people to do something, we take money away. And I think it's a similar thing with housing, where it's like, if we want to incentivize, it's like this idea that you can manage unhoused people with discipline, that you can discipline poor people into housing. And I think it's like one of the most, I think it's just the combination of, the particular combination of paternalism and cruelty that governs the policies around unhoused people are like, I mean, if that won't turn you into a fucking communist, like, I don't know what will.
You would think.
Right. I have a question about gentrification.
I was about to ask that question. Good job.
Oh, there you go. We should co-author the questions,
That would be a great idea because my brain is dead.
And I mean, and where I'm coming from with this is, and again, speaking as someone that I don't have a deep knowledge in terms of housing issues, but it seems to me kind of one issue I have with how the left often frames gentrification is it seems like people give more emphasis to the idea of like losing a sense of an indigenous community, whether that's imagined or not, and more about kind of like respecting a culture, respecting a community. That's weighted heavier than like the actual meat of it, which is like people's fucking housing costs are going up, and that is causing this. And I think that's a problem because then out of that, it's almost like what's weighted more is the idea of like, oh, if you're a middle-class white person in this gentrifying Black neighborhood, make sure you're nice to your neighbors, make sure you say hi. And that's like what is given more. But I think it stems from this framing of like this idea of there's an indigenous community and that's the problem. And I don't know if some of you saw that video of I think it was a recent Black Lives Matter protest in New York where they go to this taqueria who they think is owned by a white person. Turns out it actually might not have been a white person. And they're like, we don't want you here. Like, they've
been there for years.
Yeah, I don't know the whole story. I think it was a relatively new place, but the owner actually wasn't white. but I think it all stems from this idea of like, yeah, the issue here is that like you're not a real authentic Mexican restaurant and you're breaking up this authentic community. So I don't know what people think about that.
No, that's a really cool question. And I think it's like, honestly, I think what you're talking about, right, is the way that the aesthetics of gentrification often seem like, because we rarely see the like machinations of fucked up landlords, but we see the ways that our streets change over time. We rarely see people getting evicted or their rents going up or they're taking multiple jobs to like, or adding another roommate. Like these are things we rarely see, but we often see like the new sign with the like sans serif font or whatever, right? So it's like there is an unequal visibility of the ways that our neighborhoods gentrify. And I think that that's kind of what helps motivate that really, that like obsession with gentrification aesthetics. However, gentrification does have an aesthetic in the sense that any project of ethnic cleansing has an aesthetic, right? And it's the focus on, the focus on like cleanliness in the gentrifying project that comes with the like violent displacement by brutalization and incarceration of people living outside, that comes with the that comes with the militarization of public space, right? That's what we understand as clean. That does have an aesthetic, and that is something that we should really be concerned, that we should concern ourselves with. But I think that I think that that's kind of what you're speaking to with like, why does this loom so large in our understanding? I think another thing to understand is that like we live in a deeply individualist society, and that individualism cannot obtain on the level of like what to do of gentrification, right? Because gentrification is not a set of individuals making individual decisions that like miraculously wind up with the erasure of people of color in a community, right? Gentrification is displacement and replacement of the poor for profit. It is a collaboration between real estate developers, landlords, and city governments to grow budgets, to grow tax bases, raise property values. And that project can only be understood through like collectively. It is it's a project of collaboration, and that's why in order to do anything against it, we can't be focused on our individual consumer choices about where we live and where we eat. We have to be focused on the collective project of solidarity making between neighbors. So yeah, I think you should say hi to your neighbors, but I also think you should probably help organize your neighbors to go on rent strike if their landlord won't fix their heating in the winter. I think that you should be organizing your neighborhoods so that you can so that we can dream about replacing the police with self-organization. I think that you should be supporting the people who live outside in your community because they have the right they have more of a claim to public space than anyone else. And so I think that that's like, maybe that's kind of how I'm thinking about that dynamic, that there is like an over focus on the aesthetics and the individual rather than the sort of material basis and the collective possibility. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely.
Pascal, do you have a question?
Yeah, I wanted to ask, do you generally agree that bad housing policy is pretty much a bipartisan consensus? Has there been any kind of incremental betterment from either one of the two parties? Or is this a really kind of almost part of the way in which the neoliberal turn in the last 50 years has framed the issue, means that there's no better actor at all?
Yeah, that's a cool question. I mean, again and again, I will just reframe the question around tenants themselves, because the sort of like hypomania around like left-wing politicians just seems to be like a cycle of like over enthusiasm and betrayal, right? And that rather than engage in that process, like you can build left-wing institutions of tenants. Like you can build institutions that are like made of and for working class people. And so maybe those institutions are like much more interesting to me as like sites of action than either party. I do think that there's like, there is, of course, like Marcus, I'm looking at your left of Bernie sign, like Bernie signed on to a homes guarantee, right? Like there is that's probably the only policy framework that is being leveraged towards the goal of like universal public housing. However, I do have a lot of concerns about the way that policy might be used as a policing tool. And I think that we can see this, the reason why I think the reason why you guys invited me is because that judge who ruled that, Los Angeles needs to provide shelter for everyone who lives outside, following like New York's policy. New York has that right. There is a right to shelter here. But the way that that's leveraged is as a policing tool, because it takes away your good joke. Good joke in the chat. That was the first.
That's like
might be the visual,
right? Though.
Yeah, this is my left hand.
Yeah, but that is used to sweep people off of our streets. That's used to incarcerate them, harass them, brutalize them. And so I think for me, I think that is like, if you're talking about what's the policy framework on the democratic whatever that could be anywhere close to, useful, it could be that. But I also just want to be clear that we should be really wary of the implications it has for policing.
No, I'm not expecting you to, be romanticized about Democrats, because we definitely are not here on this show. But I was just wondering, do you really find that any distinction at all between the way in which the Trump administration was handling housing under Ben Carson, where it was his HUD chair, and now we have with Biden, we have Marcia Fudge. Is that in any way even remotely incrementally a better? I mean, Trump being a real estate guy, there was a lot of concern in terms of what he was going to do with public housing and government housing overall. I was just wondering if you have any thoughts on that at all. I mean, I think you can say in the, it's the classic, how do you like your racism? Like up or on the rocks? Like, it's like, I prefer it. I guess I'd prefer it like on the rock. It's like, I prefer it on the rocks. I prefer that we have a fair housing law, right? I prefer that discrimination against people of color in like seeking housing is illegal. I actually prefer that. I do. So that in that sense, there has been a major improvement after there's been a major improvement now that Ben Carson, like, ding dong, Ben Carson is gone, right? Like, however, I think because of the suffusion of policymaking with public-private partnerships, I'm more interested in looking to tenants themselves as the protagonists of whatever revolutionary housing future that we have. So thinking about organized tenants in their communities, in their cities. We're also a part of the Autonomous Tenant Union Network, which is working across the country and even internationally. So I think for me, it's about turning our attention to our own homes, our own apartments, and because, and I say this because we do have tools that governments don't have. We have the power of collective bargaining and the withholding of rent in the rent strike. We have the power of direct action that can keep people in their homes if they're under threat. And these are tools that we can use regardless of
policy, regardless of what party is in power at any given time. And so those are the things that I really want to celebrate and move people to when we think about like what's next for our housing future.
I want to ask this one real quick. We have some organizers on the panel. Paul is one, Marcus is another. Pascal and I just complain.
First step.
It starts with a complaint. Down south by you, also the Debt Collective is located out of Los Angeles.
Mm-hmm.
Do you ever work with them, cross coalition stuff?
That's actually amazing to ask because we're really working right now. I'm working really closely with Hannah Pell, who is in the Debt
Friend of
Collective
show.
in LA. Oh yeah, really? Okay, great. Yeah, she's great, and she is working with the Debt Collective because so many tenants have rent debt right now. So many tenants have spent the pandemic unable to pay rent, accumulating rent debt. And like the Debt Collective's framing is so important on this, right? Like, yeah, like if you owe the bank, $10,000, the bank owns you. If you owe the bank like $10 billion, you own the bank, right? And so there's this way in which the collectivizing project of communalizing debt that they have been doing in the Debt Collective is really necessary and applicable in the current conjuncture that we're in, thinking about rent debt and how many tenants are facing a statement that says they owe something that basically is tantamount to a fine for following government orders and staying inside. So I think that's like one point that we're like trying to think about a toolkit for responding to eviction notices, but also for like connecting people around rent debt, and that's something that we're doing in our own union. To organize tenants who have rent debt to leverage their rent debt, to use that debt as a bargaining tool rather than an eviction sentence.
And go ahead, Marcus.
Well, I guess I have a question. There's a lot of things that you've written about and talked about that bleeds into a lot of other issues, and we like kind of mentioned them before, and the sense of like universality being kind of a goal as far as like housing and some other major issue areas. But then all like this public-private partnership also being one of the issue areas, and whether you're talking about housing, education, healthcare, some of these guarantees and the actual people who work against. But I guess my question is like, do you see any melding of movements and like my comrade has been mentioning, like so like the land back movement as far as guaranteeing like the land autonomy to indigenous cultures, have you bleeding out with that, or even just like the sense of universality, like saying that like housing should be a human right, good education should be a human right, and like Paul mentioned how difficult it is to get in the weeds of some of the housing stuff, but I'm sure you'd be a lot more able to kind of talk about the failures of the way public education is funded, or the way charter schools, and so, yeah, my question is like, is there any reaching out that you see past your specific issues, dealing with the similarities of all of these issues, which, essentially is capitalism?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. And I guess maybe I think of, it's both, I feel like when you go into one single issue, what you find is everything else, right? So this is actually true of, I think that you could probably claim this around any particular struggle. I think that the tenant movement is a really amazing place for thinking through so many intersections of people's lives, because not only is it an essential site of secondary exploitation under capitalism and a site of like the primary like primitive accumulation of the enclosure of public space for capital extraction, right? So it's like leveraging against these two central processes. It's the site of our social lives, right? Like it is the place where we understand ourselves and our communities and our families and our friends, and it contains within it all of the complications of that. And particularly, I would say like the gendered labor of social reproduction, right? Of like simply surviving happens in the home. You know, the work that you do to connect to your neighbors and like build a social life, that happens around the home. So I think that there are these ways in which by organizing at home, in our homes, like for our homes, we're actually really we're really organizing for a different world. And I think that happens in I'm thinking about like the mutual aid work that was happening in the union, where we realized that if, you know, one of the things our rent strike was organized around the idea of food, not rent, that during the pandemic, people needed food for their families. They didn't need to pay rent. They didn't need to line the pockets of their landlords. They needed to feed themselves and their families. And so we started providing food because we wanted to support people to survive, to have food and to feel secure in not paying rent and supporting themselves. And so thinking about how that mutual aid work is like, that's building the union. It's building a power that exists outside of the state, and how that connects to so many aspects of our lives. Like, I feel like, I feel like the tenant movement could contain, I think thinking about what is made possible through the organizing of a tenants association in your building is the goal of that would be to never call the cops. Like, what kind of de-escalation strategies and like could you imagine for your building if you didn't think about involving the sort of like occupying force of the police, right? Like, what kind of dreams could you have for your block if you said like, what if we decided what happened in the public space of our block, not the police, right? So I think that's another place in which tenant organizing, I think it could contain so much of the like reorienting of our lives around each other and dignity and real safety. And so, yeah, I mean, I think about that a lot, and maybe some of it is like romantic and far off, but I think as with the mutual aid work, like some of it's happening now.
Well, I think it'd be silly to gauge in any action without a goal, right? And just saying what that goal is. Some might see it as hopeful, but like literally, if you don't know where you're going, you're not really doing anything. So,
I have a kind of a follow up. I mean, relating to kind of cross pollination of different movements. I've read a little bit about in other, more so in other countries in the past, like trade unions being kind of more supportive of public housing projects, especially like building trades unions, in terms of seeing it as something they can contribute to, almost like as a jobs program. And some unions in the United States have in the past done like cooperative housing programs for their members. But obviously the dream would be for if unions in this, building trades unions in this country, saw it as like a jobs program opportunity and kind of champion that. We, I think, frankly, are very far from that reality right now in this country. But I don't know if you have thoughts on that, or if you know of examples of maybe some building trades more supportive of the public housing idea.
Yeah, that's such a cool and important question, and one that is actually really like devastating in the history of the of the alignment between unions and construction unions and the projects of public housing. And that book, the Don Parsons book about public housing and the Red Scare, really talks about the realignment of unions away from public housing and to to the private market. And what we see, like I'm hearing one of the tenants in the Hillside VA Tenants Association that I write about, I'm hearing her in my head where she says, every time they build one of these fucking luxury buildings, they say it's going to bring jobs, but jobs for who? Like these are jobs that are, these are jobs to build housing that the people building them can't afford. These are jobs that are helping to displace the very people that could need the jobs. And so I think that tension historically and currently that exists between labor and tenants has been one of the essential wedges by which the democratic consensus has continued to ignore the needs of low income tenants and even position the demand for work against the demand for home. And I think that thinking about how to unify those two things and work with the unions that we have and better the unions that we have to make that coalition possible, it is really a project, is a really important project. And it's really cool that you brought that up.
I actually wanted to ask you what aspect of your tenant union work you find replicable in other municipalities and other cities. How can we take that model and spread it and advance it to a more kind of comprehensive solution?
What model were you asking about?
Tenants union model.
Oh yeah, the union. Well, I mean, really I would say to anyone who wants to start a union, you need 5 people and to come to an autonomous tenants union meeting. I mean, you could probably start with 3. You could start with 1 and maybe other people will show up. But the way that our process worked is, we started with the Know Your Rights training because we realized that in naming all of the forces that produce gentrification, one of them was tenants themselves. And tenants themselves, if they don't know their rights, if they don't fight back, if they sit idly by, these are processes by which tenants themselves produce the conditions of their own displacement and immiseration. So we focus on knowing your rights, but not as a kind of individualist offering for people to get them and check out, but to say that one of your most important rights is the right to demand more rights. And so using I say that that's probably one of the central tools of how to start. We use this when we start local chapters, is the sort of, I don't want to say weaponization, but I kind of do, of the rights that you have and the political education of those rights, but also the political education of, just what tenants are experiencing, right? To share your experiencing of living together in whatever you're in the place where you are. That is really that can be really a central starting point for a union wherever you are.
Well, thank you very much. I know it's a little late where you are, and you've been here for an hour and a half about. And I didn't tell you.
I'm gonna go to the March for Palestinian Lives. That's where I'm gonna go there, and I'm really excited that I got to be here talking to all of you, and then I get to be there with my comrades in struggle for to end the occupation and for Palestinian liberation. It's really cool to connect. In my mind, these two things are really connected. And that speaks to your question about how all the struggles are, where you find the intersection with the struggles. It's just been super fun.
Thank you so much for coming out, Tracy. We really appreciated you coming out, and I enjoyed reading your articles as well. Please come again.
Sure, man. Call me.
Well, and you have a book coming out next year, is and kind of on the same issue, probably like expanding on. Well, I'm assuming it's kind of an expansion on the article that you wrote in the New Republic.
Yeah, so me and my mentor Leonardo are writing this book called Abolish Rent, and we're really just thinking about the tenant movement and the goals of the tenant movement, not as affordable housing, but as the abolition of rent. So that's the provocation that really starts the book. And then, but yeah, don't worry, it won't come out until next year. So that's actually a great time for me to come back and talk about that.
All right. Well, take care. And as Amy Goodman says, wear a mask.
Is he the only one that says it?
She always ends the show with, and wear a mask.
You're a much better interviewer than Amy Goodman. No offense, but she's not.
Boom.
No offense.
I'm not offended. I'm not.
She loves to do a here's the answer that I want you to say in my question. Yes. And I'm a little like, girl, can you let the people make their points? Like,
Ford Foundation. Get to your rally, homegirl, and we will talk to you soon.
So nice to meet y'all. Have a good one.
Bye, Tracy.
Thank you so much.
That was Tracy Rosenthal, the co-founder of the LA Tenants Union. They're actually doing some really good work when it comes to keeping people in their house and keeping their rents at a reasonable level. If you read the article that I believe I linked in the description to this show, they were looking at what, like 200% rent increases for the one of those units that one of those buildings that they kind of got together to organize around. I think they said the rent went from $850 to like $2,400 because of what she talked about. A program was ending. So it's a very good piece in the National Review. Is it New Review or National Review? I get it confused. Which one was it, Pascal?
It's the National Review. The New Republic.
New Republic. Yeah, New Republic.
National Review is a right-wing publication.
Yeah, National Review.
It's like, I have to read that sometimes too.
We believe in housing for one specific race of people.
What's wrong with the white ethno state?
What's that? Right? Jesus. That's what would have happened in the National Review.
She was quite amazing, man.
I thought she was going to be a little older. I'm not going to lie.
Something that like Pascal I think was like important too is going to how do you spread it out? And like housing policy, it's going to be different state to state. It's going to be different locality to locality. But that's where you say like, what are we trying to work towards and where are we at? You know, and basically I think a lot of the things that she's modeled with some of the organizations that she's helped build, it's like you basically got to figure out where your locality is on the track and then plug in and then go from there. So things are going to be different across the states. However, you know, a lot of times it's basically, are you in the shittiest place for housing or some one of these moderate areas, and then going from there.
Very good point, Marcus.
Did you get all your questions out, Pascal?
I got most of the important ones. I had a few smaller ones, but you know, I appreciated her not buying into the whole Democrats are better, Republicans are worse paradigm. I thought that was very important.
Well, I mean, housing policy didn't get better under Obama. When who's that guy that ran for president? The twin Latin fellow?
Oh,
Castro.
Julian Castro.
He was the head of HUD, and it wasn't like it was great under him. I mean, the same cuts were happening under him. I believe the Clinton administration started a bunch of cuts for affordable housing.
Hope 6 starts under George H.W. Bush, but it really takes off under Clinton. So I agree with her analysis that it's really kind of a bipartisan consensus of crappy housing policy.
I mean, it's been that way for 30 plus years.
Yeah, part of it too. This is something that I talk with Isaiah James about. Is like when HUD is not able to actually, they can only give money. HUD is used as a pass through for developers, and not a model to actually provide housing. And so that's where it's like, oh yeah, we're housing and urban development. We're going to help out. All it does is pass along money, to the developers that she was talking about earlier, that they're not providing permanent housing. It's just a temporary thing. And they just take profits and then kick people out, redo the building, sell it for millions. See you later.
And we're seeing that now with even the new build outs, like we were talking about a little bit on the show, where there was a development in, I want to say, East Texas, where usually you sell off each unit individually, but instead they actually rented the units out as they built them, and then sold the entire tract as a whole to venture capital.
That's one of the things I wanted to talk to her about, is with the role of private equity in the contemporary housing market, and how talk about, working class housing. I mean, middle class housing is being made obsolete by the way in which venture VCs, venture capitalists, and private equity firms are now investing in whole neighborhoods. We talked about this briefly in another show, but it's
and I talked about it before when it was just me, yelling into the void in the studio. But the Moms for Housing was a pretty, should have been a bigger wake up call to the American public altogether when it comes to venture capital seizing property and just sitting on it, literally parking money. And we saw that with malls in the 80s, and now you see what's going on with that, all these dead malls. And it's not just things like Caltrans that take stuff through eminent domain for projects that never happen. It's a lot of venture capital money buying up entire zip codes because of foreclosure. And since there was no moratorium on mortgages as well as rent, we're probably going to see a lot more foreclosures. It's been pretty quiet in the news about the rate of foreclosures, even evictions. Evictions have still been going on. There's a video, if you want to see, of Tracy, where she's on a panel with a young lady out of Kansas City. And Kansas City had a real bad eviction problem like 6 months ago. During this supposed moratorium on evictions, people were going to court via Zoom. Court dates were all fucked up. If your connection was bad, if you didn't have Wi-Fi, people are losing their homes left and right now.
And yet we have a housing bubble that's developing all over the country because of this infused capital coming in and investing in large scale. It's just
how are you going to compete with large scale capital that's getting money at 0% interest? Like, seriously, how, if you're not from the tech world and you've cashed in on your stock options and you can overbid, California, was a couple years ago, we had the highest overbidding for a single family residence, $823,000 over asking for a 3 and a 2 under 2,000 square feet in Sunnyvale, California.
Was it made of gold and platinum? What?
No. You're talking about
this is like absolutely crazy too. But like right now, just to rent an apartment, you have to come with the credentials that you had to buy a house 20 years ago. And in order to buy a house, you need to be coming in like fucking Tony Montana. You need a briefcase full of cash and some muscle in order to get a house, and you got to be willing to pay for it that day, that moment. This is like, I don't know, man. And that's like, I'm getting pushed out of my fucking neighborhood right now. Like, owner said, listen, can't fucking renew lease past this date. I've seen houses been plucked out, boom, boom, boom. Family's gone, revented. Now it's white with the blue trim. Like, I don't know.
Charles says only Sunnyvale he knows of is a trailer park. Sunnyvale is actually in Silicon Valley. It's maybe 25 minutes or so from San Jose, California. It is a decent neighborhood.
Does Rokana live there?
No, he probably lives in Campbell somewhere. Mountain View. I forget where Rokana lives, but that is his district, actually, is that area. But I wouldn't say it's a really nice area. It's like any other. It would probably look like a working class neighborhood anywhere else, but because you have so much tech money down there and you're so close to the main offices for things, people have the money to buy. So it also changes the makeup of the city, right? Like if you're a teacher in Sunnyvale, you teach at a public school, how can you afford to buy a house if they're overbidding $823,000 on a 3 and a 2, 3 bedrooms, 2 baths? I think it was like 1,600 square feet. So that's not a giant house. That's a pretty small standard
Like,
home.
I feel like that house better have the Umbrella Corporation as a basement. Like, to have that much money, you better be able to go down in your basement 30 floors.
I got bad news for you, man. $1 million homes in the Bay Area do not look like $1 million homes.
They left a shovel in the basement for you.
It's the overbidding that's happening right now in the suburban areas is kind of on another level, because some people that actually were living in the cities, possibly renting, in like San Francisco, for example, when Corona hit and they got to work from home, they all bolted to the suburb and even further out.
New York City, like, too.
Yeah. So California houses do not have basements. The first time I played a show in a basement in Marcus's hometown of Columbus. And that was like one of the first basements I've ever seen.
I'm subterranean.
I was mystified by that basement. You can put a whole room down here? Golly. What y'all need this for? Storm.
All the canning. All the jars of peaches.
I miss Columbus.
That's what we got down there. Me too, man. I'm looking to try to go back home for a little bit this summer. But
Pascal, do you ever miss New York City when you're in Miami? And
we had basements in New York, man. They were pretty nice, man. You could have like a bar in the basement, man, like a little kind of living area, parties in the basement. No basements in Florida. No basements in Miami.
I was telling Teray this story of a basement, and I might have told you this story. I don't know. I was on tour at a place called Bremerton, Washington. Marcus, do you know where Bremerton is? It's a naval town.
Yes, I did a mission, or like I had to do security for nuclear sub refueling
in Bremerton.
Yes.
Okay, so you know, small little town, little military town.
One bar.
So I played that bar. I'm being totally serious. There is one bar, and
it's a few blocks out the gate.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Hell yeah, dog.
So I played that bar, and the venue had a motel you could stay at, but the people that want to stay at the motel look like they wanted to party, and that's not my scene, right? So there's a guy at the show. He's like, you can come stay at my place. I have extra room. We're like, okay, you tour a lot, you sleep on some floors. And so we go to the guy's house and you hear a dog barking. And usually when I hear a dog barking, I don't know if you guys do the same thing, I say like, ha ha, does that dog bite? And then the person goes, oh no. So I was like, ha ha, does that dog bite? And the man looks over at me and goes, yes. Like just like that, right? So we're like, oh shit. So we walk in the house, and the guy's got pictures up everywhere of like a family, like, oh, there's a woman and children, and the woman with the children, and
all the people the dog murdered.
So check this out. I go, and I'm getting to the whole basement thing. So I go, oh, is this your family? And he goes, that's my sister. She just left. Can you believe that? She just left. And he's saying it like this, right? So we're and this band is just me and my ex, just me and a woman I'm with, just me and my girl. And so we're getting a little weirded out now. So you got this big ass dog that apparently bites people, and there's a family of the pictures of a family that they're just gone. They just left. So he takes us around the kitchen, and there's a door that leads to a basement that looks like a madman's basement. There's like those string lights that light it, and there's boxes of stuff, and it looks like someone was going to move
bodies.
That's what it looks like. And so I go, oh, did they leave their things? And he goes, yeah, she just left. Can you believe that? She just up and left. And I took her in, and she just left like that. So now we're starting to get really freaked out. And the bed is a concrete slab with a mattress on it. Like it looks like some Silence of the Lambs shit. And and so the dude, and it's a concrete ass basement that apparently he was doing some construction to. And he goes, I'm going to lock this door because the dog knows how to open it and your phone won't work. So I'll come here in the morning to wake you up. And he I was totally sure I was going to die that night. I was totally sure me and my ex were going to die that night. I was really frightened. I was looking for cameras. I was like, I know he's watching us. I know he's watching us. But she will sleep through anything. And she was terrified as well. But she goes, are you going to turn out the light? I'm like, no, I'm not going to turn out the light. And she puts on a sleep mask. She goes, well, I'm going to fuck to sleep. So, but the guy didn't kill us, of course. And he took us to breakfast in the morning. And we all laughed about it the next day. True story. Basements.
Don't ever do that. Ladies and gentlemen, I feel like, sometimes I got to say some shit so we don't get sued. Don't go into some creepy man's basement.
He was not white. He was not white. He was a Latin man.
With a dog that bites.
With a dog that bites. And he was really that matter of fact. He was really that matter of fact. What happened, I guess his sister had came to stay with him for, I think she was dealing with some abuse issues. So he took her in like that. And her and her kids, and I guess they were really close. I think it was just those two that were left. And when she left, I guess she had met like a guy and just left. So he was very upset about that. But, when you meet someone at a bar that's going to let you stay at their house, you don't really think to take deep dives into their family life. But welcome to my world, Marcus.
I mean, listen, man. I just feel like for the safety of the people listening, I'm not here to judge you. I'm not trying to judge your band or the person with the basement, right? I don't want that dude and his dog coming after me. But as a public safety announcement, don't do what Jason did. He's lucky.
Yeah. I am. There was multiple situations that we had touring in various countries as well, where we were like, this might not be the best idea. And that's when we started building. That's when we built a bed in the back of the van so we could just sleep in the van and say fuck it. But that was seriously one of the most frightening times I was.
Anytime you start getting like this is like a scary movie vibe, get out.
He really did say I wish I could I wish I had some of this shit on video so you could have seen his face and our face, because he was very matter of fact. And he goes, I have to lock the door because the dog knows how to open it and your phone won't work. And then he just closes the door.
Oh, see, at that point, I'm like, what am I using as a weapon? Is there any escape place? Is there another room in the basement with somebody locked inside? That's what I would be thinking.
I was so scared.
Who's already down here? Do we have a revolutionary force already in the basement that we can cultivate? I mean, this is.
What's funny is when we tell the guy the next day, and I think he took us like Starbucks, right? The next day. We tell him and we're kind of laughing, and he didn't think like, oh, and when we tell him he had hit him, he was like, oh, that probably did look very frightening that there was a mattress on a concrete slab. True story. Basements scare the shit out of me. True story.
Don't ever do that.
Don't ever sleep in a strange man's basement in a small town in Washington State. Like everything about that should have been a horror movie.
Which do you about know when that was? Like what year that
2012?
was? 2012? Shit. Oh shit. That might have been I'm trying to think. I think I might have been there like the end of 2000 oh yeah, it actually might have been around 2012. I think the fall of 2012. I was in Bremerton, Washington for a few months, just watching nuclear rods come out of a fucking submarine.
I don't remember the time of year it was because that band, me and her toured 6 months.
It was cold as shit. I remember not seeing the sun like the whole time I was there, so I don't know if
Bremerton's kind of not a pretty place.
Marcus, does your cat bite?
Yeah. Yes, he does. And this motherfucker can open doors too.
Oh, I've been attacked by a cat in Winona, Minnesota. I didn't know cats are territorial, and we got brutally attacked by a cat to the point we had to leave the people's house.
Some cats will get real pissed.
I'd never seen a cat do that before. It pounced. It was the scariest shit ever. I'm terrified of cats because of that. I will go. You know how I said I don't want a firearm. If I had to go to your house, I'd have to have a firearm to make sure the cat didn't get me. I didn't know.
Just shoot him in the leg, all right? Just try to shoot him in the leg, please.
I didn't know cats could jump like that, and I didn't know cats bit like that. I'd never seen a cat attack until this person's cat they're like, you can stay on the couch, that's fine, we'll take the cat in the room. And they didn't close the door all the way, so the cat kind of pushed the door open, and it just would wait for us to go to sleep. And once we went to sleep, it jumped and then just fucking.
Yeah, that's the thing, is like sometimes like, and he's about a year old, so like he's not all the way like mature yet. Who the fuck knows what type of crazy habits he might just like pick up. But they call it like the zoomies, what they call it, when like the cat will just go fucking crazy, just zipping the fuck around. And if you're in the way, like, yeah, they might just like Winston's ran up and down my back.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that shit hurt like a motherfucker because like every claw was just like, you know, like, I mean, he's chill most of the time, but sometimes like this motherfucker just like lights up the whole house. And sometimes it'll be like 2 a.m. You just hear.
I didn't know the cats were territorial as shit.
Have you had them fixed?
Yeah. And that's like people's like, that's what the vet said. It's like, oh yeah, once we, you know, get him snipped, he's gonna chill out.
Not
bullshit.
True.
Not true at all. This motherfucker changed zero.
No,
he was just upset.
Giving him a reason now.
Yeah, exactly. I just gave him a reason. That's it.
Horrible reason. Well, thank you guys for tuning in to the free show, as we like to call it, on Saturday, because we do not go into the bonus patron after hours segment. Tuesday, we'll be discussing. What are we going to talk about? There's a lot of things to discuss with Kelly Dietz on Tuesday.
Sugar and plantations.
So another friend of mine from high school actually is an academic and has been doing a lot of research on sugar. We had an audio only podcast episode with her some time ago last year. She actually was a historical advisor on the Birth of a Nation film. I guess I should say she's a historian, not an academic. And we're going to be talking about the history of sugar, plantation, and I don't want to say slave food. Does that sound bad? Is there a better way to say slave food?
The cuisine of non-free workers.
I like that. That's because I'm always like, hey, Kelly, you wrote that book on slave cooking, right? Someone says, why do you know so many academics? I guess I went to a nerd school.
He went to a very good high school.
It's a public school. It's a public school outside of Berkeley, California, called Albany High. And these are my friends from school, and they ended up doing decent shit with their lives. And we've stayed in contact all these years, 20 plus years later. So it's good to be able to go through your yearbook and just be like, I'm going to call this person because we need a guest.
Must be nice. If you want an expert on Ohio State quarterbacks between the years of 82 and 87, there's like about half of my high school has majored in that specific
There was a
practice.
quarterback in 82 that came out of Ohio State that was a Bears backup that John Elway torched one year when Stanford beat. It was a big upset. Is not Hogaboom. His name was, oh God, this is killing me. He was Jim McMahon's backup.
I don't know. That's too far back from my ass.
I can't remember his name.
The only OSU QB from Chicago that I remember off the top of my head was Craig Krenzel, which he had gotten the national title with
Eddie George.
God damn it,
Eddie George.
No.
He was on the Eddie George.
Eddie George. No. Eddie George was like before
Tomzak.
him.
Mike Tomzak. Thank you, Sean Moon. Fucking Mike Tomzak. Thank you.
I'm trying to think of the coach.
Jesus, killing me.
Jim Tressel. Yeah.
Tressel won that championship with Krenzel, right?
Yeah. Tressel and Craig Krenzel, yeah.
Well, yeah, we have to watch that footage of John Elway going off against a very good Ohio State team with very mediocre players because he might be the greatest number 1 draft pick of all time. John Elway. Fight me. And on that note,
I got nothing. Ohio State players go to the NFL and do absolutely nothing. So
Eddie George had a very good Hall of Fame career. Every offensive lineman. Chris Spielman. I'll go back.
You have to go back because
Archie
when you're
Griffin
dealing with
actually
shit,
had a decent career until he hurt himself.
Okay, well, you say decent career until you hurt yourself. But like, there's Ohio State will have, especially recently, will break records for the amount of people that get first round draft picked and shit like that. And then you have more developed players actually go on to do good things. And
Dante
so this is where like,
had a good NFL career. I'm trying to be nice here.
and I understand that. But when you talk about the amount of Ohio State players, once again, breaking records, and you have to pick people from looking 90s NFL or before. Archie Griffin, for what he was actually projected to do in the NFL, was, I mean, like, you're talking about the only 2-time Heisman Trophy winner. And then also, too, is like, God, Katzenmoyer was another one where, like, oh, hey, able to do great things. He ends up breaking his neck because he's been tackling like that, leading his head, his entire life. But that's what I'm saying. It's largely a disappointment. Okay. Is it a fucking broad brush? No. But when you talk about the amount,
good NFL career,
he did not have a good AJ. Come on. Now you're just fucking with me, right? Now you're just picking out names. Now you're just picking out names. But like, that's the thing is, like, just because
he was a very good plug him in the middle linebacker, but the game changed a bit on him and he had to cover more, and he was not a great coverage guy. But when it comes to run-stopping middle linebackers, he was very adequate.
And now when you say he was very adequate, what type of good sense of feeling are you supposed to get from he was very adequate? I feel like when I said, Ohio State players in mass, largely disappointing when it comes to the NFL, it completely proves my point where you say AJ Hawk was adequate defense down the middle against the run. Come on. That's exactly what I'm saying.
One of the best 2-down linebackers you're ever going to get. If you're running on first down, I want AJ Hawk in the middle in a 3-4 system. I don't want him to cover
if you have to do literally anything other than that.
I don't want him to cover any tight ends. He might be able to cover a fullback out of the backfield. If you still have a fullback. All right. Well, we've got it. We had enough football talk. People are going to lose their shit. Pascal's getting all mad. We got to talk about basketball in the late 70s and early 80s for Pascal to be happy.
Anyway.
Remember when George Gervin played?
The socks don't go high enough on the calf, in my opinion.
What's with these long shorts? If I can't see a man's ball bag fall out, that's just not basketball.
On that note,
all right, everybody. On that note, thank you. Have a good rest of your Saturday, and we are out.